He was late, his watch already a minute or two beyond the red line, tie loosened, briefcase angled like a shield against the crowds. The mall parking lot was a river of people and engines. A black executive car sat under a pale winter sky, its chrome catching the city in tiny, crooked reflections. Ricardo's hand was on the handle when a small, urgent voice called out, "Sir, please, look under the car." It was a boy of maybe 8, knees scabbed, hair plastered to his forehead, clutching something wrapped in grease-stained paper. He ran up with the audacity of someone who had practiced asking, who had learned that if you did not ask, you did not eat. Ricardo blinked, surprised out of his hurry. He bent, expecting scrap or a lost toy, and found instead a neat, hand-sized packet of fried dough, folded into itself as if to hide its warmth. The boy swallowed hard and, without preamble, lifted his chin. "I hid it," he said. "The older kids take things. I wanted to make sure I had enough." He looked quick and honest and entirely exposed. Then, with the sort of economy that only real need produces, he pushed half the packet toward Ricardo's hand. "Take it," he said. "Take half." For a moment, Ricardo could only hold the parcel in his gloves and think of meetings, of numbers, of the spreadsheet awaiting his attention. Then he remembered a face he had once seen in a photograph, someone important to him, gone now, and the hollowness of an office lined with trophies. He could feel the shape of his life rearranging like a room when someone quietly moved the furniture. He split the snack, their fingers brushing over the paper, and the boy's smile arrived like sunlight. They ate in silence, small, unhurried bites beneath the indifferent bustle of the lot. The dough was warm and textured, a simple thing made miraculous by the sharing. Ricardo's phone buzzed its impatient chorus. He looked at it, and then at the boy. The meeting, the deal, the $1,000,000 urgency receded a fraction. He missed the appointment. That night, the image of the small hand offering half a snack threaded through his mind. It was a detail he could not shake, not the boy's need so much as the boy's instinct to give. The next morning, he drove back to the same stretch of parked cars. He found the boy exactly where he had been, same patched shoes, same folded packet, but now a thin scarf looped under his chin, a scab-red thumb working a hole in the paper. The boy watched Ricardo approach with something like expectation that was both brave and carefully shielded. "My name is Lucas," the boy said without prompt. There was a steadiness in the way he said it, as if naming himself was a practice. Ricardo introduced himself. He tried to keep the voice even. "I'm Ricardo. Can I buy you breakfast?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. He tucked the remaining half of his snack into the pocket of his jacket before they stepped toward a cafe. It felt private, the two of them slipping through the shuffle into a corner of steam and cheap coffee. Over thick slices of bread and cups that steamed into the cold, Ricardo's questions were gentle. Lucas answered in short sentences, punctuated with the practical facts of survival. He had no parents. The woman who watched over him, Nusa, was not his mother by blood, but by labor and choice, a neighbor who had come to care for him after the last household that pretended to be family moved on. She cooked for a few people, sold what she made at the market, and in exchange she had agreed to take the boy in. They lived together under a viaduct, in a narrow space flanked by columns and the hum of passing traffic. The word home, for them, meant a corner with a couple of mats, a cardboard chest covered in faded cloth, and the steady routine of someone who cared enough to be present every evening. Ricardo listened and observed. For an executive who had spent years reading balance sheets, this felt like a new kind of accounting. There were deficits he had never noticed, the way people could be invisible in a crowd, the economy of indignities that add up over time. Lucas's generosity, split over a paper wrap, counted for more than any donation figure. It had weight. Before he left, Ricardo promised to come back. He promised a blanket and, foolishly perhaps, to return with more. Promises are cheap unless you make them expensive enough to matter. Ricardo felt that morning that a blanket might be an inexpensive way to show the promise had skin. When he arrived with a blanket the following day, he found Mrs. Nusa at work, a woman whose hands had the telltale stains of a lifetime at a stove, fingers strong and quick. She warmed the blanket as if it were bread, smoothing it over a thin mattress with the solemnity of someone who understood the value of small comforts. She accepted Ricardo's bag of groceries with a nod, but not with the wide, perhaps naive gratitude he had half expected. Instead, there was an assessment in her eyes, a pragmatic weighing of what help would mean and what strings might accompany it.
"You don't have to do this," Ricardo said, clumsily. He had not meant to feel exposed beneath her gaze. He was a man used to offering solutions and to having them accepted. That morning, under the viaduct, he felt clumsy with offers. Noosa wiped flour from her hands and sat on the edge of the mat, her posture unadorned. "We don't want pity," she said simply. "We just want to live. If you can help, help so we can stand on our own 2 feet, not so you can be paraded at a dinner." It was not the response Ricardo had rehearsed, and it landed with the force of truth. He had an image in his head, the philanthropic gala, the handshake caught on camera, but it was not what Noosa was asking for. What she asked for was dignity, work, a roof, a chance for Lucas to be at school. The first sharp decision he made after that was to make the help official.
The man who had built a company on the promise of practical innovation understood, suddenly and oddly, that a contract could be an instrument of dignity. If Noosa would cook, she would be hired with a salary, taxes paid, a contract that recognized her skills. Ricardo wanted paperwork, because legal recognition would mean Noosa was not merely someone to whom handouts were given. She would be an employee, with rights and the small power that comes from legitimate labor. But the company, like most organizations, had its own rhythms and a vocabulary for discomfort. He could not simply drop a person into payroll without the consent of human resources, without a background check, without a few signatures and a policy review. So he booked a meeting with Silvana in HR, the one person in the building whose job description was the intersection of compassion and compliance. Silvana's office smelled faintly of peppermint and disinfectant. Her desk was a well-ordered geometry of files and sticky notes. She listened to Ricardo without surprise. She had seen CEOs make impulsive pledges before. "We can hire her," she said, "but it has to be right. Contracts, benefits, a workspace that's safe. If you want her to live here temporarily, we need to document that too. Liability, housing codes, there are a lot of things that make well-intentioned actions risky if we don't handle them." Risk had been a guiding star in Ricardo's life. He recognized it and, in this case, accepted it as necessary friction. He wanted to move fast but not sloppily. He wrote a list of items: employment contract, 3-month temporary accommodation in a small apartment the company owned, enrollment papers for a school, a promise to provide meals at reduced cost in the company cafeteria while Noosa worked. He wanted to help to be an intervention that respected agency and protected both the company and the family it intended to support. Word moves fast in offices. By the time Silvana had drafted the initial contract, a cautionary voice surfaced. Marcelo, Ricardo's oldest partner, who preferred the clean arithmetic of risk and ROI to messy goodwill. Marcelo's cynicism was a profession. He even had a way of articulating the unspoken anxieties of boards and investors. "You can't just start bringing people into the company," he said when Ricardo cleared things to the boardroom. "What's the precedent? Where does it stop? This is a slippery slope. We need governance."
It's temporary housing with a formal lease, paid employment for Noosa, school for Lucas. We'll write it into policy, set review points. This is not charity theater. This is structured support. Silvana tapped her pen and then nodded. "If you mean structured support, we can do it. We'll need documentation, proof of guardianship or custodial agreement to enroll the child, background checks for the living space, and an internal policy that ensures no one here is beholden to you personally. It has to be institutional." Marcelo's face hardened into a map of concerns. Investors will ask why company resources are going to a private family. You're inviting scrutiny. There are reputational costs. Ricardo felt the room close around the word reputational. He was well versed in reputation, how public perception could topple a decade of success, how a single misinterpreted act could be recast as self-indulgence. Yet he also knew the scene of the boy under the car. The choice he faced was not between a safe ledger and an unsafe impulse. It was between being the person who looked away and the person who looked. "Screw the optics," he heard himself say too loudly. He put his hand to his chest, embarrassed by his own heat. "We do it right, Marcelo. Policy, checks, review. But we do it." There was a silence in the room. Marcelo consulted his phone, then opened his mouth to speak in that measured tone of operational risk. Before he could, Ricardo added, less performatively this time, "If you won't support a proper plan, I will fund it personally. I'm asking the company to step in because it's scalable. It's a model we could replicate for others. But if the company won't, I will do this privately." That was the line that changed the tenor of the conversation. Making the offer personal shifted it from policy debate to the realm of character. Marcelo, for all his cautiousness, did not relish a conflict with the founder's conscience. Still, he filed his concerns under "to be watched." Ricardo left the meeting with a plan in hand and a sense of urgency in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He and Silvana moved quickly through the formalities. Papers were signed, a small apartment the company owned was cleaned and furnished with a modestness that respected the thin line between generosity and spectacle. Noosa, when she read the contract, asked about taxes and about whether this meant she would get holidays. She asked practical questions as if she had been given an offer of employment all along. "You'll be a cook in our staff kitchen," Ricardo explained, careful to keep the language precise. "You'll have a salary and days off. We'll enroll Lucas in the local school and help with supplies. If anything changes, we'll sit down together and decide." Noosa's grip tightened around the paper for the briefest moment. "I will not be anyone's pity project," she said. "If I work here, I work. My boy will be a boy. He will not be a poster." Ricardo's throat tightened.
He had not wanted a poster. He wanted a human life, and he wanted to be accountable for how that life was altered by his choices. The first week at the company was an experiment in small rituals. Noosa arrived early and chopped vegetables with a rhythm that made the breakfast shift flow. The smell of sautéed onions, of slow-cooked beans, threaded the halls and changed the mornings. People who had been strangers because of email signatures and departmental divides found something human in the queue at the staff cafeteria. Employees lingered longer than usual, drawn by scent and the simple pleasure of being fed well. A woman who managed accounts started lingering to ask about a recipe. A janitor asked for a spare empanada, and then, embarrassed, began offering advice about a stain on the carpet. The cafeteria became a weather system that affected everyone's day. Lucas walked the corridors tentatively, backpack swinging, eyes wide at the humming machines and the plane of polished desks. Ricardo walked alongside him more often than he would have admitted. There was a reciprocity in these outings. The company offered security and paychecks. Lucas returned the favor with small, unscripted moments of normal childhood. He pointed at things with an implacable curiosity, offered blunt observations, and taught a room full of adults to laugh in places they had become used to taking themselves very seriously. But not everyone accepted the change as warmly. A few employees whispered about privilege and power dynamics. A couple of investors sent thinly veiled notes about strategic focus. Marcelo watched with a permanent line of worry between his brows. And then, as if to keep the new rhythm honest, a legal question arrived in the form of a requirement from the local education authority, proof of legal guardianship or official custodial paperwork to enroll Lucas in school. It was the kind of practical detail that had the power to stall progress without any malicious intent behind it. Noosa did not have court papers. She had a pact of survival, an agreement made between two people who counted on each other, but it was invisible to forms. To the bureaucracy, that meant Lucas might not be eligible for enrollment. The company could not force the school to accept a child without paperwork, no matter how persuasive the human story. Silvana dispatched a lawyer to explain options: a temporary guardianship agreement, formal affidavits, a notarized statement from community leaders. It would take time. Ricardo felt the weight of time in a new way. Time was no longer just a resource in his calendars. It was a lifeline for a child whose day-to-day depended on schedules and classes. He wrote checks and signed forms, visited offices, made calls to people who had the power to say yes or no. He began to understand that doing something well often meant doing many small things right. One evening, after a long day of calls, he found Lucas sitting on the stairs outside the small apartment, legs dangling, a quiet expression on his face. The boy held a paper-wrapped snack, the same kind of dough he had first offered, and a pencil. He had been drawing, quietly, making a picture of a man in a suit holding a child's hand. The man in the drawing looked very solemn. The child looked determined. Lucas looked up when Ricardo approached. "You keep your promise?" he asked simply. Ricardo sat beside him on the step. "I am trying," he said, and meant it without drama. Lucas thrust the snack at him. "You can have it. My teacher says you should share with people who help you. You said you would walk with us. Take my hand and you will walk." There it was, the line that kept echoing into Ricardo's chest. Take my hand and you will walk. It was not only an invitation, it was a bet on shared motion. The boy's hand, small and calloused by daily tasks, waited. Ricardo took the snack, and then, for reasons he could not entirely explain, he took the boy's hand. He did not make promises he could not keep. He did not sign away his future. He did not herald a new personal brand of philanthropy. He simply held the hand of a child who trusted him with the economy of small things. The next morning, a photograph of Noosa at a work table appeared on one of the internal message boards, a candid shot Silvana had taken to explain the program. Someone added a brief caption, "New staff, lunch with a new heart." An employee pinned the photo to a communal board, and someone else took a copy to a message group. Nothing public had been released, no press conference was scheduled. Still, in a world that loves narrative, whispers became a low hum. Then, as if to test the sincerity of the choices being made, a short email arrived from the investor relations team. "Heads up," it said. "There's chatter on a local forum questioning why corporate funds are being used for private housing. Suggest we prepare an FAQ." Ricardo read the words and felt the room somewhere inside him tilt. He had bought the hardest part would be convincing the board or arranging leases and legal instruments. He had not expected the sudden arithmetic of public perception. He pictured Noosa and Lucas, two people beginning to find a foothold on a slippery city, and realized how delicate their new ground was. He called Marcelo. "We've done the paperwork," he said, listening to the caution in his partner's breath on the other end. "We've documented housing, proof of employment. This is not a vanity project." Marcelo's reply was pragmatic. "It won't matter what you signed if someone frames it as a stunt. We need a statement. We need to articulate the policy. For now, please let the external comms team handle any messaging." Ricardo felt both the comfort and the constraint of the line Marcelo drew. He wanted to protect Noosa and Lucas from scrutiny, but he also knew transparency might be their shield.
He agreed to a statement, a carefully worded note about structured support and pilot programs for dignified employment and temporary housing. It was the sort of language that would soothe analysts and give his legal team something to defend. When the email draft was circulated for approval, Ricardo read it and found his throat tighten. The words were corporate and clean, but they also rang hollow against the small realities he had seen. The sound of Noosa stirring a pot of beans, the way Lucas tucked his knees under a table to concentrate on making paper boats. The plan had to be true in language as well as in action. That afternoon, before the statement went public, a low-level crisis came into the lobby. A reporter, following a tip that had come from an employee's social post or perhaps from someone else entirely, arrived with a camera and a notepad. He asked a few questions about a man who had adopted an employee and put her on the payroll. He wanted a soundbite about corporate responsibility. Ricardo's instinct was to answer, to contextualize, to defend. But as he watched Noosa call out kitchen orders with the same assuredness she used to steward her household, he realized that the story belonged not to him, but to those who were living it. He guided the reporter to Silvana, who offered the facts in neutral tones, the structure, the policy, the temporary nature of the housing, the conditions of employment. Meanwhile, Lucas, who had come down to the cafeteria to retrieve a forgotten pencil, wandered close enough to hear a fragment of a conversation. He looked at the recording device with an expression that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with curiosity, an unfiltered interest in the way people made sound out of matter. The reporter's questions were not vicious, but the framing could be. It could make something intimate look transactional. It could make a woman who had been offered safety appear as a symbol in someone else's narrative. Ricardo felt the press tangling into the edges of his intentions. He felt protective, and a new, less easy emotion, exposure. Silvana later told Ricardo that the legal team recommended a short public statement, transparency, pilot program, respect for privacy. Marcelo wanted it lean and date-like, metrics, review period, budget. Ricardo wanted, if not poetry, at least a phrase that honored Noosa's agency. He insisted that any public note explicitly affirm that the decision had been made with the consent of those involved. In the light of the new visibility, Noosa herself became a subject of consultation. Ricardo asked her to tell him in plain terms what she wanted. She considered it and then said, "I don't want my life to be a lesson for anyone. I want my life to be my life. If you must speak, speak about what you did right. Speak about how a job can make a person breathe differently." It was the most demanding request he had received. It was also the truest. She asked not for secrecy, but for fidelity. Tell what is, not what is convenient. As press mentions multiplied in quiet loops, forums and small local blogs, Ricardo felt the fragile architecture of their first weeks shiver. This was the until that the headline seemed to promise. Trust had been placed, and the world, as it often does, was ready to test it. The company prepared its statement. The board scheduled a short session to answer investor queries. Marcelo scheduled a call with the PR team. And in the small apartment, Noosa ironed a tiny shirt and spoke to Lucas about what it would be like if more kinds of people knew their names. He listened, and the way he listened made him smaller and larger at once. On the morning a photographer was due to take a few staged photos,
carefully unsentimental, meant to humanize without exploiting. Lucas paused at the apartment door. He looked back at Ricardo, then reached for his hand as if offering a compass. "Take my hand," he said, and with preternatural seriousness, "and you will walk." Ricardo took the child's hand. The moment held the world like a breath. Outside, the city moved as always. Engines, footsteps, errands. Inside, a man with power and a woman with quiet authority and a boy who knew how to share made a fragile, living arrangement. In the boardroom minutes later, Marcelo stood and spoke about precedent, about governance, about the necessity of guardrails. He asked hard questions and imagined worst-case scenarios: misinterpretation, dependency, activists with megaphones. Ricardo answered with patience and with the rawness of someone who had eaten warm dough with a child on a cold day and found his priorities changed. The board leaned into the debate. The legal team proposed a 3-month review, the comms team prepared a short FAQ, and HR arranged for a social worker to visit weekly. It was all procedural, necessary, and it felt to Ricardo like the scaffolding of a house being raised while its occupants waited inside. The commitments were real enough on paper. Yet the specter of until lurked in the margins. What would happen if a single misstep, an ill-worded statement, a leaked private photograph, a grumbling investor, made the arrangement seem less like structured dignity and more like an impulsive spectacle? Would Noosa and Lucas be reduced to symbols? Would the company retreat under pressure? Those possibilities, unspelled and persistent, occupied the edges of every conversation. That afternoon, Ricardo walked through the kitchen where Noosa worked. He stopped and watched her move, not as the man who signed checks, but as someone learning to measure his life by different metrics. She turned to him and paused with a ladle in hand. "You said you would walk with us," she said simply. "I did," Ricardo answered. She nodded, as if testing the firmness of that answer in the small gravity of a kitchen lit by tired fluorescent bulbs and the warm steam of food.
"Walk means keep going," she said, "even when folk on the outside make noise." Ricardo nodded, and for the first time in a long while he felt the echo of old promises, those to people he had loved and lost, and those to a self he had not yet quite met. He pressed a small coin into his palm, not as charity but as an awkward symbol of commitment. Lucas, watching from the doorway, made paper boats from a scrap of the press release draft and set them into a puddle in the sink, watching them spin. He whistled a tune he had picked up somewhere on the street. They were learning to navigate one another, to translate promises into daily acts. Yet the outer forces, the emails, the investor calls, the local chatter, were not absent. They hummed, a distant engine that could at any moment grow louder. When a fellow employee posted a benign photo of Noosa arranging trays in the staff kitchen, a small thread began to gather behind it. Comments celebrating the work, a debate over whether corporate resources should be used this way, and a few voices warning of moral hazard. The thread did not amount to a movement. It did, however, make the air thinner. Ricardo read the thread and felt something like exposure. He texted Silvana, "Let's hold. No press. Keep it internal for now." Her reply was pragmatic. "We're already fielding questions. Prepared a board memo." He closed his eyes and, in the silence, saw again the boy under the car. "Take my hand, and you will walk." He realized the phrase was not simply an invitation from the child, it was also a test he had accepted. To prove that walking meant more than one moment of impulse would require steady feet. A meeting was called for the following morning. Marcelo wanted a full risk assessment. The investors demanded a timeline. Silvana wanted protocols and legal assurances. Ricardo wanted Noosa and Lucas to be left to live without the glare of speculation. The tension tightened like a string. As night fell, he sat on the couch in his apartment and unfolded the paper boat Lucas had left behind, the pencil marks forming a crude skyline. He turned the paper and found a small note tucked inside, written in Lucas's small, careful hand. "Thank you for the bread. Walk with us." Ricardo placed the note beside his coffee and felt at once grateful and unsettled. The path ahead required not grand gestures, but the accumulation of modest daily acts. Dignified work, steady housing, school forms filled with official signatures, conversations with skeptical board members, and the quiet negotiation of privacy and publicity. Outside,
the city continued its indifferent song. Inside, a man with a balance sheet and a boy who split a snack had begun to redraw the map of what counted as meaningful success. The next morning would bring a boardroom full of questions and a comms team with a statement carefully honed to soothe. It would also bring a child in a backpack and a woman who wanted to cook.
Ricardo folded his hands, felt the small crinkle of the note, and stood up. He could already feel the boardroom's cold glass and the warm steam of the kitchen at the same time. He would have to answer for both. He went to bed with the image of a hand, small and calloused, waiting for his. The promise of walking together hummed in him like a small flame. The world, prepared to test every flame, would not let him walk unchallenged. But for once, he didn't mind the challenge. He had been given a path that was not measured in market share, but in mornings shared over warm bread. In the hours before dawn, a headline began to assemble itself in the edges of his consciousness. "Take my hand and you will walk," an orphan boy told the millionaire. She trusted him until... The ellipsis hinted at trouble. Ricardo felt the pressure of that unfinished sentence like a hinge. He had entered a story that would demand more than a single act. He would have to prove that promises mean anything when the cameras lean in and the numbers talk loudest. He dressed for the day, set the small note on his dresser, and walked out into the city that watched, with a heartbeat he could now hear. The first test was already in the meeting he was about to attend. The second test would be whatever came after the cameras, the questions, the investor calls. And somewhere in the rhythm of it all, he hoped, he would learn what it meant to keep walking when the world screamed stop. If this is speaking to you, stay with the story. There are choices to be made that don't fit a headline. He walked into the boardroom with the paper boat pressed flat in his pocket, the small note's creases a private map of promise. The room smelled of lemon polish and old decisions. Investors sat in their usual places, phones oriented like compasses. Marcelo arrived punctual, face folded into the map of risks he knew how to read. Silvana opened the meeting with a neutral nod, and the comms draft projected on the screen. Careful language, bullet points, mitigations. They began with the practicalities, timeline, budget line items, the terms of temporary housing, the payroll code for Noosa's employment. The legal team recited contingency plans, privacy clauses, limits on photography, protocols for staff requests. Ricardo listened, his thumb tracing the paper boat in his pocket as if it steadied him from inside. Then an investor cleared his throat. "We need to understand the president," he said. "This could set expectations. Boards worry about exceptions becoming obligations." Ricardo felt the old weight of metrics pressing on him. It was a familiar gravity. He'd learned to make decisions under it. But the image that had altered him, small fingers offering half a snack, was not a spreadsheet. He looked at the faces around him, and for a moment thought of the boy's solemn invitation, "Take my hand and you will walk." "We're not building exceptions," Ricardo replied. "We're piloting a policy."
We will document every step, measure outcomes, and if the pilot proves unworkable, we will revise. This is about dignity, not optics. We paper it properly so people like Noosa and Lucas have the legal protections they deserve. Marcelo's mouth tightened. You say policy, I say governance. A company is not a charity. We have fiduciary duties. And we have citizens working within these walls, Ricardo answered quietly. People show up with families, with needs. If we can structure support in a way that upholds dignity and doesn't create dependence, why wouldn't we test it? Why not evaluate outcomes like any other project? Silvana added the practical voice. We can put a 3-month pilot in place, with weekly evaluations by HR and a social worker. We document everything. We include clauses that protect both the family's privacy and the company's obligations. We'll have an external advisory panel to review outcomes. The room weighed the proposal. It was, in the end, an argument about what it meant to be a company in a city of people, not statistics. The board voted to proceed with the pilot on those terms. Tight oversight, external review, a press statement prepared but not released until the family consented. Relief was small and immediate. Ricardo's hands shook when he left the room, not from fear but from the recognition that decisions, once made, require a kind of endurance. He took the stairs 2 at a time and ducked into the small apartment the company had prepared. Lucas was at the sink, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to fold a paper boat that would float straight. Noosa hummed as she ironed a child's shirt, handling the fabric as if it were a small force to be tamed. "You did it," Lucas said when he saw Ricardo. His voice had the pride of a child who counts a good outcome as something partly his own. "We did it,"
Ricardo corrected. We did the paperwork. Now comes the harder part, doing it well every day. Noosa looked at him with that steady appraisal he had grown to respect. Walking means keeping going, she had said. Now she watched him as if measuring his stride. They moved into routine with a gentleness that felt improvised and right. Mornings began with Noosa's cooking and the hum of a small life inside the apartment. The hiss of the kettle, the scrape of a wooden spoon, Lucas packing a backpack with the solemn care of a child entrusted with schoolbooks for the first time. Ricardo, who had once measured days by board meetings and product launches, started keeping different calendars, school schedules, parent-teacher nights, the day a social worker would drop by. At the office, the cafeteria became a slow instrument of change. The smell of simmering tomatoes and garlic threaded through corridors that had previously smelled of printer ink and stale coffee.
People found reasons to linger at midday, drawn by food and by the small invitations that food offers. A question about a pot, a recipe swapped, a memory shared. Productivity metrics did not change overnight. No single loaf of bread can remake a corporation, but the air did. Small talk thickened into a kind of shared humanity. Teams that had been siloed for years bumped into one another in line and discovered shared problems they could actually solve together. One afternoon, a junior designer, someone who had been quiet for months, approached Noosa while she was ladling soup. She fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve and asked for the recipe. "My abuela used to make something like this," she said, and then, changing course, "Can I help in the kitchen sometimes? I mean, if you don't mind?" Noosa looked at her, and the exchange sparked a ripple, a volunteer sign-up that asked nothing of the company, but gave employees a way to invest themselves in a neighbor's life. It was small, plausible, and without fanfare. Still, the world beyond the glass did not stop scrutinizing. Someone at the company took a candid photo, Noosa stirring a pot, Lucas peeking from behind her shoulder, and posted it on an internal group chat with a brief, admiring caption. The post was meant for internal celebration, and for many it was. Others, less comfortable, bristled. A low-level murmur began that would not have mattered in a smaller institution, but here it threaded outward like a hairline crack. Before the company could finalize a public statement, the photo migrated to a public forum. Someone from the office had, unwisely, shared it beyond the private group. Within hours, comments piled on, praise, curiosity, and a handful of cynical takes that framed the arrangement as a PR stunt. A local columnist wrote a piece called "When Philanthropy Meets the Boardroom," asking whether such moves were performative. An aggregator picked it up. The internet's appetite for neat narratives found one: a man with money, a woman with a stove, a child with a snack. Ricardo woke to the buzz of his phone and the sour taste of exposure. A reporter called for comment, and a thread of speculation had already begun to grow. Investors sent terse messages. Marcelo's caution rose like a tide. "It's viral," Marcelo said when Ricardo explained. "We need to manage perception. These things can snowball into legal inquiries or activist pressure." "We already documented everything," Ricardo said, but his words lacked the steadiness he wished. Words are necessary armor, he knew, but they do not shield the small people at the center of a story from being spoken about without their consent. He pictured Noosa's hands and Lucas's small face, and felt the particular vulnerability of living under a spotlight that can cut as much as it warms. Silvana moved swiftly. She called Noosa and Lucas into a quiet office, and sat with them to explain what had happened. They listened without surprise. This was not a life that had been insulated from the world. Nasa, when the idea of press was raised, folded her hands and spoke in the plain cadence of someone who knew how to weigh costs. "If we speak," she said, "we speak what is true. Not to make a story for you, but to keep ourselves safe. If you must say something, let it be what we agreed: the pilot, the paperwork, the family's consent." Ricardo wanted to take the issue into his own hands, to argue with the world, to set the record straight in the clearest terms he could. But the decision to speak belonged to those being spoken about. He swallowed his urge to dominate the narrative and offered instead to amplify their words when they wished to speak. The company released a carefully worded statement, drafted with Nasa's consent and Silvana's legal care. It explained the pilot's terms, the protections in place, and the family's participation. It emphasized the dignity of paid work and the temporary nature of the housing. It made clear the company's intent to evaluate outcomes and to involve external partners. The statement was not a stilted corporate script. It was a map of commitments that could be verified. Public reaction was mixed. Some applauded, some saw a spectacle. The chorus of online voices produced heat, but not in the end a legal hammer. Investors watched. Marcelo breathed measured, critical breaths. The headline that had once been impending, "Take my hand and you will walk," found its way into a dozen comment sections, often misapplied. Someone somewhere added, in the voice of a tabloid, the tantalizing ellipsis, "She trusted him, until." It was a hook that suggested drama. The truth, as it had been from the start, was steadier and quieter. Then a new test arrived in an unexpected seam. A contractor at the company misfiled a background check. It was an administrative error, an email sent to the wrong inbox, a name swapped on a form. The school system, already wary, flagged the error and delayed Lucas's enrollment for another week. For Lucas, the delay felt like a private winter, a day without a routine, a classroom missed. For Nasa, who had arranged mornings around drop-off and collection, the pause was an irritation that became a worry. For Ricardo, the administrative snarl felt personal. He had counted on bureaucracy to be the bridge that legitimated care. When bureaucracy failed, care was left exposed. He moved to fix the problem with the same patience he had learned to apply to other human matters: phone calls to principals, legally clarifications, a signed affidavit from a community leader confirming Nasa's guardianship for the time being. Silvama orchestrated the paperwork. A social worker provided the additional forms required by the education authority. The process took longer than anyone wanted. It cost money. It cost time. It cost small pieces of certainty.
When Lucas finally walked into his classroom for the first full week, his teacher, an ordinary woman with a kind voice, leaned over and said, "I'm glad you're here." It was a phrase without spectacle and with everything that mattered. It was a kind of quiet redemption that felt as significant as any headline. Lucas's shoulders lowered, as if a small weight he had carried for a long time had been taken away. As the weeks passed, small reciprocities multiplied. Employees began bringing extra lunch once a week to the staff kitchen as a voluntary offering, not charity, but a gesture of fellowship, a bowl of beans, a plate of fruit. Neo, an engineer who had been sullen in meetings for months, became a reluctant helper in the kitchen, chopping cilantro with the exaggerated care of someone trying on a new role. A mid-level manager who had lost a sibling found solace in the routine of coming down to eat what Nusa cooked. She sat among colleagues who had previously seemed distant and discovered empathy in a line for soup. Even Marcelo could not remain untouched by the shift. He observed the slow changes, improved punctuality among certain teams, more casual exchanges across departments, an uptick in voluntary mentorship, and tracked them against the hard data he preferred. When a client visit unexpectedly went smoother because a cross-functional team had been able to coordinate over a shared lunch, when an otherwise tense product delivery was discussed with less friction, Marcelo found himself conceding, in fragments, that human cohesion had value he could not always quantify but could certainly measure in fewer missed deadlines and improved morale. His conversion was not dramatic. It came in small, stubborn increments. A conversation with an engineer whose daughter had been signed up for an afternoon tutoring program organized by an employee volunteer group. An unexpected thank you note from a cafeteria worker whose morning shift had become steadier because of the new arrangement. Marcelo's face, once mapped by worry, softened in places. He began to speak less in hypotheticals and more in the language of outcomes. He still asked hard questions, but now they were tempered with curiosity rather than pure caution. The cultural shift reached a public moment when, during a company event meant to celebrate a product milestone, Ricardo asked for a quiet pause. He had arranged a small, low-key unveiling, a mural in the staff cafeteria, not for promotion but as a marker of memory. The artist, a local muralist who preferred to work with paint over press, had been commissioned to create an image that honored an act rather than exalted a person. Two hands meeting over a small paper-wrapped snack, surrounded by the textures of the kitchen and the city. Silvana had debated the unveiling. Marcelo had insisted on a short statement that framed the mural within the pilot's measurable goals. Nusa, consulted as ever, had asked only that the mural reflect truth and modesty. On the morning of the unveiling, the cafeteria smelled of fresh coffee and simmering beans. Employees gathered, not for cameras, but because something in the company felt like it needed to be acknowledged.
Lucas stood to one side, a small man with a backpack and a serious face. Ricardo stood near him, shoes scuffed from his walk that day. Sylvana stepped forward and read a brief note about dignity, work, and the company's commitment to a structured pilot. Marcelo, who had been present at the board meeting that allowed the program, watched attentively. Then the tarp came down. The mural was simple and tender, a child's hand offering half a wrapped snack to a man whose cuff suggested a suit. Around them, the kitchen and the viaduct and a small apartment rose in soft color. There was a caption, chosen with Noosa's approval: "Take my hand and you will walk." Below it, in smaller letters, the statement noted the pilot structure and the company's commitment to evaluation and respect. The room held its breath. No cameras were allowed. No press had been invited. This was for the people who shuffled the company's daily work, and for those whose lives had become entwined with the pilot's quiet demands. Noosa, who had stood at the pot as a kind of heart, wiped her hands on her apron and smiled in a way that made everyone else in the room feel slightly less guarded. After the unveiling, Lucas walked up to Ricardo and handed him a paper-wrapped snack. He had spent the morning shaping it with a proud care of someone who knows the currency of small things. "For you," Lucas said, and in his voice was the gravity of a child who had learned how to trade trust for company. Ricardo felt something like a tide lift inside him. He unwrapped the snack and tasted it, the same fried dough texture that had started everything. It was simple and warm, and in that moment, the world felt aligned in a way that numbers rarely made it. He took a small bite, and then, without grand declarations, took Lucas's hand. The gestures were private and profound. In them lay an economy that no boardroom could fully account for. News of the mural did eventually spread, but the framing shifted. Employees wrote short reflections online about how a colleague who had been distant had become a friend after midnight conversations over tacos, about how an extra plate had saved a night when someone could not cook. The story that began as a potential scandal bent into one about small acts changing norms. The company had modeled a way to act that was neither patronizing nor performative. It had been messy, legalistically awkward, and above all, human.
Months later, the pilot evaluation arrived with the documentation Sylvana had promised: attendance at school, stable housing records, Noosa's employment documentation, a small internal survey showing increased employee engagement in teams connected to the cafeteria, a modest improvement in retention for staff who had participated in voluntary programs. The external advisory panel recommended continuation with adjustments, clearer privacy protocols, a replicable process for screening and support, and a partnership with a vetted local nonprofit that could help scale solutions responsibly. Marcelo, who had once warned of slippery slopes, presented the board with a report that analyzed both risk and impact. He spoke in the measured cadence of a man who had listened and adapted. "We can create a policy that scales," he said. "We must do it with guardrails, measurable milestones, and external partners." There was a nod of approval from legal, a murmur of assent from investors who appreciated the data, and a quiet gratitude from those in the room who had watched a life shift. Noosa, when asked if she wanted to continue, placed her apron over the table and looked at Ricardo. "I work," she said again, with her usual clarity. "I am not a lesson. If the company will let me keep cooking and Lucas can go to school and sleep without rain on his face, then we will continue. If not, we will find another way. But if we continue with rules that protect us." That insistence on rules that protect rather than define became the program's North Star. Policies were written not to make the family a curiosity, but to embed their protection into the company's processes. Confidentiality protocols, consent forms for any press involvement, a social work partnership to ensure long-term stability without dependency. A modest budget line was created for dignified support for families in similar situations, directed through the third-party nonprofit. The model was explicit. Company funds would be used for structured interventions, not for ad hoc displays. In the months that followed, the company became one small example of how private institutions can act with humility. There were no miracle cures, no sudden transformations that erased systemic inequality. There were, however, discrete improvements. Lucas learned to read, tried out for a school play, and discovered the sticky comfort of being part of a class that expected him to show up. Noosa earned holidays and a pension contribution that gave her an unusual feeling, one she described as being counted for once.
Ricardo learned to measure a successful quarter differently. He began leaving his phone in his desk on certain mornings to be present at breakfast. The reciprocity was most visible in little gestures. One winter week, when a storm interrupted the city's transit lines and employees were stranded, the staff kitchen stayed open late.
Noosa, who had become a quiet anchor, passed out bowls of caldo to coworkers who had never eaten in that cafeteria before. Conversations stretched into the night. People who had been strangers arrived as neighbors. The engineer, who had once sat hunched at his desk, now walked home with a colleague, and when the conversation turned, spoke openly about his father's illness, about the fragility of plans. In 1,000 small ways, the company's social fabric rewove itself. The moment of true closure did not arrive in a headline or a shareholder report. It arrived one afternoon when Ricardo found Lucas at the sink, making paper boats out of a calendar page. The boy looked up and grinned, the way children do when they want to share a small triumph. "I floated 3 boats today," he announced. "They sailed across the puddle. I want to make more." Ricardo crouched to Lucas's level and looked at the boats bobbing in a sink puddle, a tiny private sea. "Will you walk with me today?" Ricardo asked, not as a test, but as an offer. Lucas considered the question, and with the sort of decisive economy his life had taught him, took Ricardo's hand. "Take my hand," he said, and then, as if to make sure the phrase would not be mistaken for a slogan, "and you will walk." The mural remained on the cafeteria wall. It became a quiet thing employees pointed to sometimes when conversation turned to the company's values. Visitors asked about it, interns took selfies in front of it, and the local artist sometimes stopped by to touch up a color, preferring not to be photographed. The pilot continued with transparency and with partner organizations involved. The company published a short report, not as a trophy but as an accountability measure, and links to the organization that coordinated further support were placed in an internal resource hub. People sometimes asked Ricardo if he had changed overnight. His answer was always the same. "No, I just had to learn how to keep going." That learning involved paperwork and awkward calls, and the humbling work of showing up again and again. It involved being corrected by Noosa. It involved listening to Marcelo when he raised hard questions, and listening to his employees when they said what the kitchen had done for them. There were moments the world still tried to fit them into simpler narratives. A columnist once asked whether heroes needed to be wealthy men with companies. Ricardo's reply was quiet. "You don't need a company to be kind. You need presence and you need consistency. If companies can be part of a system that helps people stand, and if they do that with humility and with rules that protect rather than spectacle, that's worth something." On a warm afternoon, long after the first snack had been split in a mall parking lot, the company's small community gathered in the cafeteria to celebrate a model's milestone. Lucas had completed his first semester without absentee days. Noosa set out bowls with care. Employees came with small homemade contributions. Laughter rose and blended with the clang of cutlery. Ricardo sat at a table where people could be themselves. No press, no speech, only a circle that had been made not by an executive order, but by 1,000 small invitations. Near the end of the meal, Lucas slipped across the room with a paper-wrapped snack he had made himself, flour dusting his knuckles. He stopped in front of Ricardo, eyes bright with the gravity of a small envoy. "Remember when I gave you half?" he asked. Ricardo smiled. "I remember. I carry it with me." Lucas pushed the snack toward him. "For you, so you'll remember to walk." Ricardo accepted it. He unwrapped the snack and tasted its warmth. It tasted like a day he had chosen differently, and like a dozen days he would have to choose differently again. As the room broke into ordinary conversation, the narrator leans in, not to punctuate, but to invite. "When was the last time you looked under your own car, under your own assumptions, and noticed someone who needed a hand? What would it take for you to offer half of what you have, not a spectacle, but a steady presence?" Small acts arranged with humility and lawfulness have a habit of remaking the places where we work and live. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity matters. In the description, you'll find a short list of vetted organizations practicing dignity-driven support in communities, ways to give that respect agency and structure assistance responsibly. Walk with someone this week in whatever small way you can. A meal, a moment of attention, or asking how a person would prefer to receive help. "Take my hand, and you will walk." He had been offered that first in a parking lot, the same invitation that had redirected a life. In the end, the walking was less about one person leading
and more about the slow, stubborn choreography of many people choosing, again and again, to keep pace with one another.